Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. This one is called AWS for Dummies, and I called it that for a very specific reason, and that's because when you're just getting started with AWS, even if you're a very seasoned developer, it's just confusing. It's very intimidating. The learning curve is massive. I mean, they've got whole certification courses on the web that people make careers out of. Because of how complicated and how feature-rich and how many services there are on the platform. Now, I have one simple goal for this entire video, and that is to conquer your fear of using Amazon Web Services and just give you a little bit of confidence that as you're learning it and starting to use it, you're doing it in the right way, you're looking at the right things, and you just have a general idea of how to navigate the console. AWS has over 200 different services, which is very substantial, and that can be super intimidating when you're just jumping in. So that's the goal of this video. I'm going to walk through a few prerequisites here. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you have at least a little bit of experience building and deploying web applications. So this is not a total beginner video, although you could consider this kind of a beginner's video for AWS. But, you know, the intended audience of this video could be anyone from, someone just getting started with web development, wants to get into deploying their apps on AWS, to even a seasoned developer who is very good at writing web applications, knows that side of things really well, but just needs a little bit of a quick start to Amazon Web Services. You should also have a general understanding of cloud providers and what they are out there for, what their purpose is in the world. Not too in-depth of knowledge required here. Just understand, you've got the code that you're trying to deploy to the world, and you should have just a general understanding of how we take that bundle of compiled code and ship it off to a cloud provider that may host that code. And perform some sort of DNS resolution so that your end users can see the web application that you've built. And then finally, a little bit of courage. I know this stuff, Amazon Web Services, is very intimidating. Not going to lie about that, and it definitely has a very large learning curve. So that kind of leads into this next part. This video is not a deep dive into AWS. You are not going to walk away from this couple hour long video feeling really confident about using AWS from a service level. We're not going to be diving into any specific AWS product. We'll look at a couple of them. So we'll look at some of the common ones. I'll try to point out things as we go, but my intention is not to dive into any specific service and give you details about it. It's more of this 10,000 foot view, just so that you can have a broader understanding of AWS, how all the services work together, and how to just navigate all of them. All right, so what are we going to be learning today? I'm going to first start out with AWS from 10,000 feet. I want to just give you an idea of how do we conceptualize this? How do we make sense of such a big platform all at once? I'm then going to try and walk you through some of the core concepts. So that's like accounts, users, groups, regions, availability zones. These are kind of the broad strokes that apply to everything and anything that you do with AWS. We'll also look at some common services. I'll walk you through some of them that you might want to start with as you dig into those on your own. We'll talk about a very, very important concept that I wish that someone would have explained to me when I had first started, and that is how do we create, update, and delete different services on the AWS platform. There's 5 pretty common ways that you would do so, and we're going to actually take a very basic web page, just going to be some silly little HTML document or something with maybe a little bit of JavaScript, and we will take that, bundle it up, and we will deploy it to AWS in all 5 of those different ways, just so that you can see interactively how that all works. We'll then jump into Cost Explorer and just how to prevent large AWS bills. There's plenty of horror stories all over the internet of people who have racked up, thousands of dollars of charges within a single day. And while I can't say that you can entirely prevent that, there's such thing as an infinite loop in programming. As long as you're relatively careful and go through the steps that I show you here, you should be pretty safe in terms of that. And then finally, we're going to go through an introduction to the AWS documentation. That will kind of be sprinkled throughout the entire video. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is look at AWS from 10,000 feet. So that first bullet here, and the way we're going to do this, we're going to drop over into Figma. I know this is quite the beautiful design that I've got here. Not my strong suit, I will admit. But we're going to look at this diagram as a visualizer for how AWS is constructed, and then we're going to jump into the console and actually see these concepts live. So how I like to think of AWS is the physical world versus the digital world. We are, of course, talking about a cloud provider, which blends the two. And with AWS specifically, it's really important to distinguish those two things because unlike other cloud providers, some of them that are more simple, that kind of abstract away these concepts, AWS really implements these physical versus digital concepts even within the console. I can't tell you how many times I've been searching for a specific deployment that I have created, and I was not finding it because I was in the wrong AWS region within the console. So these are really important concepts. So let's zoom in. We're looking at the physical world, and with AWS, it's really all about regions and availability zones. So how you can think of regions and availability zones, there's some good explanations on this webpage right here down in the benefits section. But basically, a region is kind of a collection of data centers. And you can think of an availability zone as an individual data center. So something that has a redundant source of power and isolation. In other words, an availability zone, you may want to deploy your apps to multiple availability zones because one of them, let's say it catches fire and totally burns down. This is an unlikely event, but if you have critical infrastructure, you want to have your app deployed to multiple availability zones, so if some physical disaster happens in one of them, you've got that redundancy in another. So you can think of regions, like for example, we've got the Oregon region down here. That has 4 availability zones, so 4 separate physical locations, and within each of those locations, you've got a bunch of servers. These are highly protected infrastructures with all sorts of employees and physical equipment. So if we come back to our little diagram here, you can see that I've mapped out, say, region 1, this might be Oregon, and then region 2, this might be the Virginia region on the east coast of the United States. And then within each, you can see each of these, you can think of them as individual data centers. Now, cutting into the digital world, this is kind of where the two blend together. On the digital side of things, this is what you can think of as the AWS console that we're about to jump into. So the main concepts that you need to understand is that everything is centered around the concept of an account. Now, an account might mean a lot of different things depending on the context you're in. You can think of an account as a discrete unit of isolation for your services. For the sake of this tutorial, we'll only be logging into a single account, but as an individual or a company, it's actually recommended for companies to have multiple accounts. So for example, you might have your production workloads. So all of your production apps might live in one account, your staging apps might live in another account, and then you might have a third account for something like developer tools. This might be where you host your continuous integration and deployment pipelines, maybe a code commit repository. That's kind of AWS's equivalent to a GitHub. And you can have all of these different accounts for that isolation for different purposes. Now, for an individual, it probably doesn't make sense to have all of those different accounts, so you'll just have one. Now, I know I just said that these accounts act as these isolated containers for your services, your users, and your groups, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can also talk in between accounts. So there's some advanced features of AWS that allows for that. So let's say that you're, working with some sort of database provider, and they run their own managed database service, and they're actually using AWS under the hood. And then your company has AWS for all your infrastructure, your applications, and you want to connect the two. There are ways to do that. Things like VPC peering is one of those ways, and account links. So don't think of these accounts as entirely isolated, but in general, they're going to provide some sort of redundant protection for you. And then finally, and most importantly, the question of, well, how do I connect to these different accounts? So you can think of each account as just a login. So if you come down here to your developer computer, so this is just the laptop you're using, you can connect in with either the console or programmatically with an access token to an individual account. So you can't be logged into multiple accounts at the same time, although there is a single sign-on capability with AWS that you can set up as part of like an organization so that you can quickly flip back and forth between all of your organization's accounts. That said, you can only be logged into one at a time. So just as a 10,000 foot recap here, let's start from logging into an account all the way to how that translates into AWS infrastructure. So you're working on your computer down here and you go log into your AWS account. We'll say it's account 1. Then you'll have users, groups, and services. You might have logged into that account with a specific IAM user. And then that user is going to be part of a group that has access to certain services. Now these services will be deployed to separate regions, and then it could be deployed to multiple, one or more availability zones within each of these regions. So you can think of these accounts as isolated, but they can deploy to any of the regions and have services deployed to any number of availability zones within each of those regions. All right, so we have covered that 10,000 foot view. We're now going to jump into accounts, users, groups, regions, and availability zones, some of which we've already kind of overviewed, but I now want to walk through this in a more tangible, practical way by actually logging into a specific AWS account. So let's jump on over. And you can see that I've logged in. So I'm gonna go ahead and sign out of this account so that you can see the whole process from start to finish. Now there's this really important concept with AWS, and that is the concept of a root user and an IAM user. So you can think of the root user as the account owner. So we talked about those individual accounts, and the owner of each account is going to be that root user. And then that person can go in, create a bunch of individual IAM, identity access management users, and then assign usernames and passwords so that maybe the individual developers that are working in that account can go log in and access a certain predefined amount of services. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first log in as the root user. I'll show you how we create IAM users. We'll log back out and go in as an IAM user. All right, so let's assume that you've just created your AWS account, you've logged out. Now we're going to log in as the root user, and then let's say that we have a couple of employees or contractors that are working on services within those accounts. We will then go through the process of creating those IAM users for that access. So we'll start with the root user, which, by the way, you should only be logging in as the root user to do administrative actions. So if you want to update billing, like a payment method or something like that, or you need to do something that requires root privileges, then you'll log in as root. Otherwise, you would want to create an IAM user for yourself. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go in as root to start with. Got to type in my MFA code. Alright, so we're logged in for the first time. I want to point out a few things that will be really helpful to you as you get more comfortable with AWS. The first thing is the search bar. So you can of course go over here to services and you can see all of the different categories. These are not individual services, these are just categories of services. And if you were to click, say, compute, then you've got all of these different services to choose from. Now, I don't really use this drop down ever, and that's because this search bar. This thing is indispensable for any AWS user, and you can literally just type whatever you want. It's always going to find exactly what you need. So let's say that I wanted to go to EC2, a very common, one of the oldest AWS services. It's going to pop up right here. Click on it, and then you'll be dropped into that individual dashboard for whatever service you're looking at. I know this is super intimidating. Try not to dig into this too much. But the second thing I want to show you is, aside from this search bar, you always need to keep track of what region you're on. Now, you can configure this within your AWS dashboard to have like a default region. You can also put some account controls to kind of restrict which regions you can deploy services to. That said, you should always keep an eye on this. You should always know which region you're working in, because it's very common to, say, deploy a service to one region and then you log in next time, you're on a different one, you can't find that service, and sometimes services even get lost, and then you might be paying a few bucks every month for something that you didn't know even existed. Okay, so I'm in the US East region, US East 1, and now what we're going to do, we're going to go back to our main dashboard, and we're going to jump into Identity and Access Management. Now, this is kind of the core security protocol for all of AWS, and there's a million things that it can do. We're not even going to barely scratch the surface, but what I did want to do is show you the core concepts of creating an IAM user, assigning that user to a group, and then actually logging in as that user. So let's go ahead and use the search bar, type IAM. We're in the services section right here. We'll click that. And just as a helpful hint, as you're going through all of these different services, you should always have the AWS documentation up. So just type it into Google, go to AWS documentation, and then here are all of the guides for every single service. So if you want to search that, let's type IAM, and what you'll see is all of the documentation for that. So if we clicked on IAM, then you'll see a very, very comprehensive user guide or API reference. Usually the user guide is where you're going to want to go. And this will walk you through pretty much every last detail that you would ever need. They have really good documentation at AWS. It's very intimidating, but it's also good that they have all this documentation. So something that I always do when I'm looking at a brand new service, because it's basically like learning a whole new development framework or something like that, is I'll go to the user guide, and you can usually find something like how IAM works. And this is where you'll go to read through some awesome diagrams, some terms, and it'll just walk you through all of the core concepts. But of course, we don't have time for that in this video, so we'll just dive in. And from the IAM dashboard, you can see a couple of really important things. So over here, you've got the account ID. This is a unique identifier for this specific account. And then we have the account alias, which you can see in my single sign-on URL that I've got set up. That's how that is identified. Now, that's a little bit advanced. We're going to just jump over to one of the core concepts of IAM, which is users. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to add a user. And I'm going to say YouTube test user. And then these are really important options that you can select down here for each user. If we go back to the presentation here, you can see that I've called out a console versus command line access, and that's exactly what these two options are. So if we go to the deploy types, so how are services created, updated, and deleted, you'll see that you can do it in the console, or you can do it with the AWS client or AWS CDK. So these couple options down here require you to click this access key when you're creating the user. And that will assign a short-lived access token for that particular IAM user that they can use for the AWS client and other programmatic command line sort of deployment methods. And then, of course, if you want to be able to log into this console, you have to select the password. And what we're going to do, since I'm deleting this right away, we're just going to type in a custom password, and I'll just show it for now. We'll say YouTube test 456, very, very secure password. And then we'll uncheck this. Usually you'd want to do this if you're setting this up for, say, a contractor. You can basically just click this box and then they'll have to reset when they first log in. So now we've got permissions, and at this point you can create some sort of user group. So let's go ahead and create a group. You can also do this from the main tab. So if you were to go back to the original view of IAM, you can create groups. But we'll go ahead and do this here. And what we're going to call this is, let's say YouTube contractors. So this might be a group that you throw any contractor that's coming and helping you out in. And for this specific example, let's say that we want this contractor to only be able to deploy services in the EC2 category. So let's go to EC2, and you can see there's some predefined roles that AWS kind of manages for you, and you can see that in the type is AWS managed. In almost all cases, you're probably going to want to use these predefined roles. So we'll click Amazon EC2 full access, and that gives read, update, delete access to all EC2 resources. So we will go ahead and create that group, and you can see that we have selected that group as what this user is going to be in. We'll go to tags. These are really useful. We're not going to get into them during this video. And finally, you can see that we've got a YouTube test username. I'm going to jot that down real quick just so that I'm not forgetting it. And then that's assigned to the YouTube contractors group, which only allows EC2 access for this user. So we'll go ahead and create the user. And you can see that we've got this access key, which I'm going to copy here. I'll also show you how to get to that after the fact. So let's go ahead and close this. And now what you can do is click on the user. And if you go to security credentials, this is where you'll see the access keys. And actually you cannot see them after creation, so it's important to save them. But as the root user, you can always create a new access key, show it here, and then save that. So you can see that I just created a new one that will allow me to programmatically access AWS. All right, so just to kind of bring this full circle for you, let's go ahead and use the search bar. We're always using the search bar to type in EC2. Now remember, we are logged in as the root administrative user for this AWS account. So when we click EC2, we're going to be dropped into the dashboard, and we're going to be able to do whatever we want in here. So for the sake of this tutorial, let's go ahead and spin up an instance. This is literally just a compute instance. You can go deploy whatever you want to it. So we'll go ahead and launch an instance from this root account. We'll call it YouTube EC2. We'll go down, keep it the micro, free tier, eligible. I'm going to delete all this right after. All of these things are just things that you're going to have to learn on your own. These are just all the different options you can assign to an EC2 instance. But we're going to go with the defaults, and let's see. We'll proceed without a key pair, not recommended, of course. So we're going to launch this instance, and then we're going to re-log in with that IAM user that we just created, and they should be able to delete this instance because we gave them full access. Now, another thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the S3 service, which is just object storage, and we're going to click that and create a specific bucket. And remember that IAM user that we created does not have access to the S3 service, and therefore they should not be able to do anything to this bucket, and I don't think they can even read it because we would need to give them read access. So let's go ahead and create a bucket. Alright, YouTube storage. Note that we're putting it in the North Virginia East region, and we'll just go ahead and create that. Let's see. Oh, I guess we already got that. So YouTube storage 123. All right, so you can see that bucket, and you can see YouTube storage 123, and then we could go ahead and upload, say, files from your computer to this bucket, and then you can retrieve it from some remote server. So let's go ahead and upload a file. I've just got some very simple text file. It's a very complicated upload method through the console. Probably could be a bit simpler, but that is pretty common with AWS. So let's go ahead and add files, and we'll go to AWS demo and select the test.txt file. All right, so we'll go ahead and upload that. So that succeeded, and we can click on that file. And then from here, you can, this would be the object URL. We've got this bucket blocking all public access, so we'd have to set up some sort of some intermediate resolution to allow someone on the public internet to access this file. But you can always click open up here, and you can see my file just says hello AWS. So we're going to go log in as that IAM user, and we should be able to read this file, but we can't delete it. And that's only going to apply after we've assigned that permission. So let's go to IAM, Identity and Access Management again. And this time we're going to create, we're going to go to the user and we'll attach an inline policy. So this is not going to apply to the entire YouTube contractors group that we created. It'll only apply to the YouTube test user. So if we click on the YouTube test user, and then let's see, let's go ahead and add permissions. And what we're going to do is attach existing policies directly. So what we're going to search for is read-only access to S3. So S3, and you can see that's full access, and here's Amazon S3 read-only access. If you wanted to actually see what this policy looks like, you can click on it. And you can see that every policy, even the managed ones, is just a JSON document that has specific statement that will allow certain actions on a certain resource. So that's kind of how you dig into that. But for now, we'll go ahead and just assign that inline to this user. So we'll add those permissions. And so now, just as a recap, our user, if we click back on users, is this YouTube test user, which is part of the YouTube contractors group. And this YouTube contractors group has full EC2 access. And this specific user has read-only S3 access. So two different services here. Everything else should be off limits to this user. So let's go ahead and log out finally. We probably should not have been doing all of this with the root user in the first place. But anyways, let's go ahead and log out. So I actually forgot one thing. Before you log out and log in as an IAM user, you're going to need the account number. So this is really important, and where you can find that is in the IAM dashboard over here as the account ID. So go ahead and copy that so that you know what you're dealing with, and then you can sign out, log back in, and then you'll select the IAM user, and it'll ask you for that account ID, and we'll paste that in there. So we click next, and now this is where the IAM username that we just created is going to come in handy. So we'll type in YouTube test, that was our username, and then our password, very secure password that we'll delete. We'll paste that in, and then we'll sign in. Okay, so now we're looking at the same exact dashboard, but this is going to be an entirely different experience. If you can see up here, we're logged in with a specific user at a specific account, and if you were to go to account and try to manage that, you wouldn't be able to, because this user doesn't have access to do that. Only the root user can do that. Okay, so let's go first to EC2. Remember, we assigned this user to a specific group that has access to EC2 instances. So we can go to the instances. You can see the one that the root user had created earlier, and it's in the running state. So in theory, we should be able to click on this EC2 instance, go up to instance state, and terminate it. Okay, so we're gonna go through this obnoxiously large dialog here, and it says successfully terminated the instance. Now you can refresh things and you can see that the instance state running is no longer showing anything. Let's clear that filter, and you can see that we have an instance state that is shutting down right now. And you're not going to be charged for this anymore because you shut it down. Now, let's go over to S3, which is another service that we had set up. And remember, as we're going through this, make sure that you're looking at your region. Now with S3, this is kind of a unique service with AWS. It's always going to be the global region. It's not region specific. But with EC2, that is going to be region specific. So always make sure that you're looking at that same region. Now, what you'll see is you'll see YouTube storage right here, that bucket that we created. Now the question is, why can we see that? Well, the reason we can see that is because we gave read-only access as an inline policy to this user. So let's click that bucket, and if we click on the file that we uploaded, we should be able to open it and see it. So here's our hello AWS file. Now the tricky part is we did not give this user any sort of access other than read-only. So if I try to go over to the object actions, and let's see, where's the delete button for this? Let's go ahead and click that and click delete. Now, when we click delete, it's not going to work. So it's going to ask us to confirm and make us think that we have the ability to do this. But what happened is it failed to delete. It's a very discreet message, but you can see the error over here is access denied. So in other words, we don't have permissions to do this with this user. Now let's just bring it full circle. Let's type into the search bar IAM and go back to that dashboard. And actually, I kind of forgot about this. Even for the IAM dashboard, you would have to assign a specific role to that user so that they can see it. So these errors right here are actually expected because we didn't give this user the ability to look at IAM stuff. IAM is actually kind of an elevated privilege. So at the root account, you can set in your account settings the ability for individual IAM users to even edit the IAM access. It's kind of like a little bit of inception going on there. But yeah, this would be expected here. But that's kind of the overall concept. I know that we only scratched the very surface of all of this stuff, and there's all sorts of things that you could get into with this access management. But I wanted to just show you the process of logging in as that root user, which you should not be doing on a normal basis, and then creating the actual, day-to-day users that will be logging in like we have here, and will have access to certain types of services to do their job. All right, so we covered the first two things here in this list. We looked at AWS from 10,000 feet. We'll kind of go back to this real quick, where you're looking at the physical world and the digital world. Then we talked about individual accounts, which have users, groups, and services, among a few other things. And then we went through the process of logging in as the root user to an account, creating an IAM user that has assigned a specific group that has certain permissions to access a set of services. And then on our computers, we logged in through the console and we tried to do things with those services we had access to. Now, the overarching question that you're probably a little confused about is the services themselves. Now, I did say we're not going to be digging into any specific one during this video. I'm kind of leaving that as an abstraction to say like there's these group of services. We're not going to talk about the details, but I do want to walk through some of the common ones that you might want to start looking into, going back to this AWS documentation where you can just jump in and start learning about the different services. So we're going to walk through a few of those. Some common services that you want to know are going to be split into a couple different categories. Now, in the AWS dashboard, if we go back to that and we click on services, you'll see all of these different categories here. We're not even going to touch the surface of all these different categories. I've actually come up with my own that kind of makes sense in my head in terms of what you would most commonly be looking at. To start out, we're going to look at EC2. Elastic Compute Cloud is, I believe, what that stands for, where EC2, the C is times 2. That took me a while to get, actually. But EC2 is, I think, the oldest service on AWS. It was basically the core, the entire AWS platform for the first several years. And as you go through documentation, you'll actually notice that a lot of things are tied to EC2 that don't necessarily make sense to be tied to EC2. And a lot of that is just legacy systems that have not been kind of separated into their own buckets. So that's kind of a little bit of history there. And all of these things fall under the compute platform. So basically just bare metal servers that can take some sort of process and run it, whether that be a web application, a cron job, or some sort of machine learning if you want to get a really powerful computer to do that with. That's what we're talking about when we say compute. So EC2 is just this general purpose compute platform. It's basically like, hey, here's a little computer that you can use and do whatever you want with. We also have AWS Lambdas, which is kind of walking into the serverless stuff where you just define individual functions and then those functions will run on their own. They will start up when they need to and shut down after they're done working. So the next thing would be the Elastic Container Service, or ECS. This is becoming really popular and for good reason. It basically takes containers, like Docker containers, and you basically put your app in a container and deploy that container to the cloud. And then ECS is this orchestration tool that basically, handles a fleet of containers that are either running a set of EC2 compute instances or what they call Fargate instances, which are kind of managed. And they will basically just auto scale your app for you. So that's a really popular one. And then we have Amplify and things like Elastic Beanstalk. These are kind of managed services. Now, if you've ever worked with maybe Vercel, or let's see, what's another good example of this? Heroku, something like that. Those are all kind of like developer-friendly, a little bit more beginner-friendly services. And that's what Amplify and Beanstalk are. So moving on to storage and database, you've got S3, which is the object storage that we just looked at. As we saw in the example, you can take any sort of file and deploy it, or not deploy it, but upload it to an S3 instance, and then that is persistent storage for you. You've got Amazon Aurora, which is kind of the SQL or RDBMS offering. And then the NoSQL offering is going to be DynamoDB. And then finally, the key value store, so Redis or something like that, is going to be called Elasticache. Then we move into security and networking. This is one of the biggest topics within AWS. We're not going to get into it because it's pretty loaded. But everything in AWS is going to be revolving around this thing called a virtual private cloud, or a VPC. This is basically an isolated set of networking components that all of your services can be deployed into, and it's how everything talks to each other. So once again, we're not going to really get into that because that is many videos on its own, but just know that you'll really need to understand that if you're working with AWS. And then finally, within the security and networking, there's plenty of other services, but Route 53 is a pretty important one. That's basically AWS's managed DNS service, where you can register domains and manage all of the domain records for those. Something I left out from here is ACM, which is the certificate manager. So if you want to register an SSL certificate for a specific domain, you would work with ACM to do that. And then finally, in the other category, things that I thought were sort of notable to talk about would be the Cloud Development Kit. This is relatively new, and it's one of those deployment methods that I had talked about here. So AWS CDK is one way that you can deploy services to the infrastructure of AWS. Also, CloudWatch, this is really important. This is where basically all of the logs for services will go to. It's kind of an aggregation tool, and you can do a lot of things with that. So knowing about that's important. And then finally, you've got AWS's entire CI and CD offerings. So they basically have from end to end services for everything that you want to do from the developer tool space. So code commit, for example, would be a replacement for GitHub. Questionable whether you'd actually want to use that. In my opinion, GitHub is 1,000 times better than AWS code commit. Nevertheless, they provide you with a repository hosting tool. Likewise, you'll have things like code build and code deploy, which you can configure to build a specific app and deploy it to, say, an EC2 instance automatically. And you can maybe orchestrate all of that in a code pipeline, which will go through the process of running your tests, running your builds with code build, and then using code deploy to actually put those out onto servers that will run it to the outside world. All right, so I know I totally blew through all of these services, didn't even really get into the details of what they do. This is more of kind of a reference of like, hey, go ahead and start here when you're learning on your own. At this point, I don't think it's really worth trying to get into how each of these work, but rather let's go through an example of actually deploying a basic web application in all the different ways that you can do so. So, like I said, there's 5 primary ways, or at least in my head, that you can use AWS and get things deployed. The first one would be the AWS console. That is the easiest way to do things, but it is not very maintainable. I'll explain what I mean by that when we get there. The next thing is AWS Cloudformation. Now this is bolded and in a different color because it is very significant for your journey as an AWS practitioner. You really need to know what CloudFormation is and how it's basically the underlying language that pretty much all the services use. So, for example, if you're using Elastic Beanstalk or AWS Amplify, things that are kind of point and click, upload your app and we'll do the rest for you. All of those are going to be using CloudFormation templates under the hood to actually orchestrate and deploy each of the services that are required to run your application. When we get there, I'm going to walk you through the CloudFormation console, and I really want you to pay attention to that and understand what it is and why we're using it. Next up is the AWS CDK, which is basically an abstraction on top of CloudFormation. So it's basically saying, hey, you can use a general purpose programming language to define the services that you want to deploy, and then you will run through that programming language and synthesize, is what they say, that logic into CloudFormation templates, and then those templates will actually deploy to AWS. So that's a layer on top. It's a fairly new service, but I've used it. It's awesome. It's a really, really cool offering that they have. Next up is the AWS client. So this is literally just if you're on the command line, you download the client and you can run individual commands or scripts that will take different services and deploy, update, delete, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the last one is a little bit obscure, but I say another AWS service, and for the reason of certain AWS services can actually deploy other AWS services. So if you think of certain services as building blocks, then more abstracted or higher level services can take those building blocks, piece them together based on a specific configuration, and then orchestrate how those will be deployed across your AWS account. Once again, AWS Amplify or Elastic Beanstalk is a great example of a service that takes other building block services and orchestrates an entire deployment for you. All right, so in order to walk you through these different deployment methods of how we interact with AWS, I've created an index.html file. We're going to call this our web app. That's a little bit liberal usage of the term web app because it's just a HTML document. But let's go ahead and open that up. Let me see if I can get this a little bit larger for you. Okay, so we've created the index.html. Let's go ahead and go into Vim and get started here. So let's make an HTML document. We will say that we want head with a title. We'll say body. Okay, so there's our web page. Go ahead and save that. And now what I want to show you is how we can take that web page that we just created. Actually, let's first make sure that I don't have any typos in there. So let's open with Chrome. Okay, so here's our Hello AWS. You can see that there. That's our web page that we're going to deploy to AWS. All right, so the first method that we're going to use to do so is via the console. Now, I had said that we could do that. We're going to actually be using AWS S3 service because even though it's just object storage, there's also a way to host a static website with it. So we're going to do that because it's the one service that's, number one, really popular and common, and also we've already given our IAM user access to use it. Or actually, we only have read-only access. So this will be a very good example of how these users and groups work. So in order to give the necessary permissions to this user to do what we need to do, we need to sign out. And generally we'd sign back in with like an admin user, but since we haven't created that yet, we'll go ahead and sign in as the root user. So you go down and sign in using root email. Okay, so we're in the IAM dashboard. Let's go to our users. And you can see we have these YouTube contractors group. So what I'm going to do is something a little bit more realistic of how this would actually work. So let's go to our YouTube test user, who, if you remember, we attached an inline policy, which is the Amazon S3 read-only access. I'm going to go ahead and delete that policy because generally you don't want to assign inline policies. You'll generally want to put a user in a group and then assign the policies to that group. So we're going to go to user groups. We'll go to YouTube contractors, and then you can see here's the user that's in the group, and then we'll go to permissions, and what we want to do is add some permissions. So we will attach policies to the group, and let's search for S3. we want to give this group Amazon S3 full access so we can go ahead and create and deploy our website. Now, what we're also going to do in this example is make this a live website. So it's going to have, we're going to just put it on a subdomain of my website domain. And in order to do that, you wouldn't know this by default, but we're going to need access to ACM and Route 53. I think that's going to be all the permissions we'll need. So what we can do is attach those policies as well. So we can type ACM, which is not going to pull up anything. Maybe it's called certificate. Okay, so AWS Certificate Manager, full access is what we want to add. But as you can see, this is getting a little bit complicated where I am, adding all these different permissions to deploy a website, and it's trying to go down the list of like, okay, what do I need? I need S3 access, I need ACM or Certificate Manager access, and Route 53. It's a lot to handle. So in practice, it would probably be more realistic to assign a general managed policy. So I'm going to show you how that works as more of a real world example. So let's go click on user groups again. We'll go to YouTube contractors and we'll go to permissions. Right now we've got these two permission sets. We're going to remove them. Okay. Now this user has no permissions at all. But what we want to do is add policies, and now I'm going to type in power user. And this is something that Amazon manages, and the power user access is basically, we can click it to get a better description. But what they define this as, I think there's a description that'll pop up here when it loads. So it says provides full access to AWS services and resources, but does not allow management of users and groups. Okay, so in other words, you can do whatever you want. You just can't elevate your privileges on your own. You have to have like a root account like the one we're logged into, or some manager has to do that. So we're going to assign that power user access. So that basically just says anyone in this YouTube contractors group can do anything with any resource. Okay, so we've attached that policy. We should be able to now sign out and log back in as our IAM user. Remember, you have to have the account ID to do this. So we'll go to IAM user, put the account ID, YouTube test, and we'll put in the password that we had saved. Oops, wrong password. Okay, so now we have some slightly different permissions, and I believe we still probably won't be able to see IAM because, like I said, that was more of an account level special case, but we'll check it out. Okay, that's right. So we still can't do IAM because the root user has not assigned the ability for IAM users to manage IAM. Okay, so we went through this little detour. Let's kind of refocus. We're talking about 5 ways to deploy a web app. Our web app is this simple little hello AWS HTML document. And we're going to do it through Amazon or AWS S3 service. Okay, so we're doing this through the console, so we'll use our search bar, and we will click on the S3 service. All right, so we've got this YouTube storage bucket. Let's go ahead and create a new one from scratch. We'll call this YouTube sample website. Now, for the block public access, we're going to have to turn this off because we're going to make this an open website that you can visit through a URL. You can actually still block public access. There's a service called CloudFront, which allows you to set up direct access to an S3 bucket over a specific CDN. So CloudFront is like Amazon's CDN service. We're not going to get into that. It's pretty complicated. So we'll just allow all access to this bucket. We don't need any versioning. We don't need any encryption. And then in advanced settings, let's see, I don't think we need any of that. So we'll go ahead and create the bucket. And it needs, what do we need? Oh, we have to acknowledge that we're doing something insecure. Okay, so here's our YouTube sample website. So we'll go ahead and click on that bucket. And something that you can do, I believe it might be in the properties. Let's see. Yep, so at the very bottom of properties, it's kind of a hidden feature, is static website hosting on an S3 bucket. So what we'll do is we'll just edit this and we'll enable the static website hosting. So we'll say host a static website, and we're going to call index.html is the HTML document that we're going to upload, and that's going to be the home page for this site. You can also put some redirection rules. Let's say that you had different web pages for different routes. You could put them in there, but in general, this is meant for like a single page application where the routing is kind of handled internally. Okay, so we've got this enabled. Now we have to actually upload our index.html document. So at the root of the bucket, this is basically like a file system where you can have little folders within the bucket. So at the root of the bucket, we're going to upload a file, and that file is going to be the index.html file that we just created. That's our website. Okay, so let's go ahead and upload this. All right, we can close this. Now we've got our website page root, and we can go to the buckets. Let's go back to sample website. And let's see if in properties, where's the link? Okay, so if you click properties, we go back down to that static website hosting. Now you'll see the bucket website endpoint. So this link right here, if we open it up, we're going to get a 403 forbidden. So we're getting this 403 forbidden error, and this is really common with Amazon Web Services where you're going to get all sorts of access issues. It's a very secure platform. You got to know kind of how that works. But what we can do is we can use this as a way to look at the documentation. So let's type in AWS docs. Go to the documentation, and we're using the S3 service. So that's right here. You could also search it. So we'll click S3, and we'll go to the user guide. Now, I'm going to guess that it has something about static website hosting right here. So you can see hosting a static website. And then you've got all of these different sub-articles that tell you how to actually do this. So let's go ahead and scroll through here. We've got website endpoints. That was basically what we're looking at here that was automatically created for us. You can look at how to add a DNS CNAME, which we're going to do real quick in a minute. But I think what we're looking for is setting permissions for website access. So when you configure a bucket as a static website, if you want your website to be public, you can grant public read access. To make your bucket publicly readable, you must disable block public access settings. So we already did this. If your bucket contains objects that are not owned by the bucket owner, you might also need to add an object access control list that grants everyone read access. So I think that's what we probably need to do. Okay, so let's start here. The block public access settings, this is what we had done. So we disabled all of those. Now it's saying step 2, we need to add a bucket policy. Now this is a little bit hidden. It's not very obvious, but that's kind of the nature of AWS. It says to make the objects in your bucket publicly readable, so to anyone visiting, you must write a bucket policy that grants everyone the S3 get object permission. Now it's giving you this warning. It says this policy below just gives all access, but you should really look at what you're doing there. For us, we're not too worried about security as it's an example. So what we can do is we can just copy these permissions right here. And let's go back to our sample website, S3 bucket. So you can see we're in Amazon S3 buckets and then the bucket. Now, if we go down to bucket policy, this is where we'll edit it and we will paste that in. Now you can see right here, it gives us the bucket ARN, or the Amazon resource name, I believe is what that stands for. This is going to be a value that you'll see on pretty much any resource you create. So whether it's an S3 bucket, an EC2 instance, even something as simple as a certificate from ACM certificates. They're all going to have a resource name, and that's kind of the unique identifier for something in AWS. As you can see in this policy, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. You can see that it's been defined for us, but right here, this needs to be filled in. We need to actually provide the correct ARN. So let's copy that right here and paste it in. So you can see we've put in the correct identifier and then a /* which means everything within that bucket. Okay, so that policy, once we save the changes, should allow everyone to actually read what's in this bucket. Okay. Our JSON has some issues with it. Let's see what we've done. Oh, okay, we have a little space right there from copying it in. A little formatting error. So now we edited the policy, and you can see in big red text that it is publicly accessible now. So that's like, warning, don't put anything confidential within this bucket. Now if we go back to our endpoint, I believe refreshing should show us our web page. So now we have a website deployed to Amazon Web Services. This is not the only way to deploy a website to Amazon Web Services. There's actually probably 100 different ways with 50 different services that you could go about doing that, which is part of the intimidation of this platform in general. Once again, you just need to kind of dig in with some of the common services, start reading about them, and you'll find the service that you need eventually. It really has to go on a case-by-case basis. But anyways, let's not get too distracted here. Let's go back and set up a domain name for this. So we'll set up a simple CNAME that points to this endpoint, and then we'll set up a certificate so that the not secure up here in the browser goes away and we have full SSL on our website. Now I'm going to probably stumble through this. I have not done this in a little bit of time, but we can use the documentation to figure out how to do it. So going back to the S3 guide, I think I had seen something about configuring a DNS setting. So hosting a static website, let's see. Okay, so here in this note on the AWS docs, it says Amazon S3 website endpoints do not support HTTPS. If you want to use that, you can use Amazon CloudFront to serve a static website hosted on Amazon S3. For more information, see how do I do that. To use HTTPS with a custom domain, see this article. Okay, so at this point, I thought that we were going to set up a domain name, but realizing as we speak here that that's going to take a lot more time. I've done this before, and I think what's going to happen here is we get into these next couple articles of setting up the CloudFront distribution. Then you point that at the S3 bucket. Then you set up Route 53, set up the subdomain, and you have to configure all of that stuff. And then when we get to the other deployment methods with like the CDK or the AWS client, this is going to become really complicated where we're going to have lots of boilerplate. So let's go ahead and not do that. We'll stick with our basic unsecure HTTP website with a non-custom endpoint. I think that's a good example that kind of covers all of the main concepts of AWS in terms of how do you create a resource with different methods. All right, so let's go back to our little PowerPoint here. And the first thing we did was deployed a basic website with the AWS console. Now, I had told you earlier that I'd come back to this about maintainability. And the reason I'm not a huge fan of doing things through the console, if you're working on an actual project, is you will create resources and then you will forget about them, or you may, fat finger a configuration setting. You have to remember all of these things, and there's no like self-documenting way to keep track of all these resources. So if we were to go back to S3, let's go back to the main screen for that. You can see just in the course of this tutorial, we've created both of these buckets. And if we, log out and go away from AWS for a couple of months, it's not going to be totally apparent what we have already deployed. So there's not a screen that shows you here are all of your running services within Amazon Web Services. The only way that you can do that is through the billing console, and you can see what you're being charged for, which is not necessarily the way that you want to find out about a service that you had forgotten about. So going back to our PowerPoint, the second way that you can do things that is a lot more maintainable is with AWS Cloudformation. Now, let's go back to the console here, and we'll go ahead and delete these buckets. Oh, we need to empty the bucket first. And then we'll type permanently delete. Once we do that, our website is going to go down. Well, it's probably cached at this point, but eventually that will go down because we're no longer hosting it. And then let's go back to the buckets again, and we'll delete the sample website. Oh, we deleted the storage, not the website. That's why. Okay, so we'll empty the bucket configuration and permanently delete it. Okay, I believe at this point our endpoint's going to go down. So we've deleted our buckets, and now we're going on to the second way of doing this, which is through CloudFormation. And this is where I really want you to pay attention, because this is probably the most maintainable way to work within an AWS account and keep track of all your resources. So if we refresh this, let's see, I'm not sure why these are still sticking around. We might have to delete them now. Okay, so we had to empty them and then we delete them. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the CloudFormation console. So we'll type CloudFormation. And this is basically a templating, like a YAML or JSON templating language for AWS resources. So basically you define the resources within the YAML document per se, and then you upload it to CloudFormation console, and then AWS will read that and it will go out and deploy all the resources contained within that document. This is commonly referred to as infrastructure as code. It's becoming very popular for good reason. So within CloudFormation, once again, you're going to have to go out on your own and learn more about this. So within the AWS documentation, you can scroll all the way down, I believe, somewhere down here. Let's just search the page. So Cloudformation, it's over here in management and governance. So you'll click that documentation, and then you've got the user guide that you'll go to. Learn all about it, Cloudformation concepts, all that good stuff. Way too much to learn within this video. I'm just going to go through some examples, and you can just try to follow along and just try to understand the broader strokes of what I'm doing here. So within Cloudformation, there are a couple of core concepts. You have stacks and you have stack sets. Stack sets are kind of repeatable templates that you can deploy to different regions and different accounts. So we're not going to get into those. We'll stick to the core unit of Cloudformation, which is a stack. And a stack is going to be a collection of resources, and that stack is basically a single YAML or JSON document. So if we were to create a stack, we can go with new resources, and then you have a couple options. You can say the template's already ready, and then you upload that, or you can use a sample template, or you can create template in the designer, which is where we can kind of put together different resources. I think for this case, let's see if we can search for some sample templates that might make sense. So let's browse by AWS service. We'll go to Amazon Simple Storage Service, so S3, and maybe they'll have a template for a website. Okay, so Amazon Simple Storage Service, Amazon S3 website, creates a website hosted on Amazon S3 with a custom DNS name. All right, so that's perfect. Let's go ahead and view that template, which you can see up in the URL. This is probably just hosted on an S3 bucket, and you can see there's a lot of stuff going on here. So we'll have to edit this to kind of simplify it into the stuff that we care about, but it's a good starting point. Okay, so you can kind of read through this. There's all sorts of terminology and syntax in here that we can't possibly get into in this video. For example, let's look at here. Let's zoom in a little bit. And within this template, you might see things like this, where it's function join. This is all covered within, let's see, where's our documentation? Okay, so here's our documentation for Cloudformation. And if you go down to the template reference and resource and property reference, here's where, well, this is not what we want. Intrinsic functions. So you can go function join. So now we have found this function that we were just looking at in the template, and it's going to tell you all about it, how it works. This is basically just a utility function that, I guess joins a couple strings. Here's an example where you would join A, B, and C together into a single string separated by a colon. So things like that will pop up in the templates. And then you can also see, as we're looking through this, that we've got this resources key. And this is basically saying like every object within this resources object is going to be deployed when you deploy this template. So the first one is the S3 bucket for the website content, and you can see that we've given it a type of AWS : S3 : bucket. So that's the identifier. Once again, you can come back here and look at things like resource and property reference. And if we go to simple storage service, we're gonna have to look through here. Maybe S3. Okay, so we found S3. You click on that, and then you can see the resource types that you can create. So if we click AWS S3 bucket, which again, that's exactly what you're seeing right here, you can click on that, and then it takes you through some syntax, and it takes you through all of the different options that you can provide for this, which is basically the equivalent of going to the console and clicking through all of those options. So it's basically taking the console and putting it into a definitive template. All right, so that's pretty much enough. The most important things that we have to know is that we've given an index document of index.html in an S3 bucket. So on our end, all we have to do is upload that index.html file, and this should pretty much do the rest for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this link or this URL, and I think what we can do is go to Amazon S3 URL, and I believe that that is a valid URL that we can use. Okay, so now this template actually has some input parameters. If we go back here, or actually let me just open this up in Visual Studio Code real quick. Got that open. It's formatted a little bit better. And within Visual Studio Code, if we can make this a little bit bigger, you'll see that somewhere in here we have parameters. So we've defined some parameters, and this one's called hosted zone. And what it's asking us for is a domain name that has already been set up in Route 53 that we're going to use as the DNS in front of our CloudFront distribution. That stuff that I was talking about earlier that we didn't want to do because it would just take too long and would be too complicated, that's what we're seeing here. So if we go back to, let's go back to our stack here, you'll see that we'd have to put that in the parameters. What I'm going to do is go previous, and instead of using this exact template, we're going to edit it so it's a little bit simpler for us. So what we'll do is we'll say upload a template file, and we're not quite ready. We've got to go back to Visual Studio Code to do this. So what we can do is we can get rid of all the parameters. The mappings, I believe these are not necessary, I don't think, but I'm going to leave them in there just for good measure. Resources, like I said, this is the actual S3 bucket definition, so that's really all that we need. The next thing, the website CDN, is a CloudFront distribution, as I was talking about, and we're not going to set any of that up. As you can see, like I was talking about, it's pretty involved. There's quite a few configuration options to set up CloudFront for this use case. So we'll go ahead and delete that from our document. And then next we have a Route 53 record set, which is basically like the DNS configuration for the hosted zone. So this is where we're setting up our CNAME that points a custom domain name at the endpoint that the static S3 is going to create. So we can also delete this. And what that leaves us with is a single resource. So in our resources block, we just have the S3 bucket for website content, and the website configuration here is set up. In the outputs, we were, the outputs, we'll see this in a second, but it will show us the website URL and the bucket name. This is just useful just for convenience, and also if you were taking multiple templates, you can actually consume the outputs of one Cloudformation template into another and use that as an input. So that's what these are helpful for. We're not going to get into that sort of detail quite yet. So let's go ahead and save this file as my sample template.json, and we'll go ahead and upload that. So we got the AWS demo. Here's our sample template. Hopefully I didn't make any syntax errors, which it looks like I did. Website DNS name in the outputs block of the template is unresolved. So let's go back. Oh, okay. So this website URL is referencing that CloudFront distribution that we had deleted. Now what we can do is we can output the website endpoint. So let's rename that to endpoint. And then I'm going to have to go to the documentation to figure out what we need to do. So this is just a good example of how you can use documentation. So we are already on the AWS S3 bucket resource, and you can see all the syntax, and then you can see the return values. So the return values are things that you can use within your outputs. So let's see. We're looking for the website URL. Okay, so let's see how if I can remember how to do this. So the property we're looking for is coming from the get attribute intrinsic function, and it's saying that for an Amazon S3 resource under Cloudformation templates, we can grab this specific property from that intrinsic function. So what we can do, I believe, I may have to try this a couple times, we can replace that function with get attribute. I think that's, I guess we need to take that R off the end. And then how we use that, I'm going to open up yet another tab. So let's duplicate this tab because I have forgotten how to use the get attribute. So we've got the template reference and the intrinsic functions. I need to go to the get attribute intrinsic function and learn how to use that. And you can see in JSON, it looks like this. So let's go back to our template and just for a moment, copy that down there. Well, I guess you can't do comments in JSON, but we need the logical name of the resource and then the attribute name. Okay, so that resource name is going to go right there, and then we just need to take this array and turn that into another string. You can see it actually completes that, I guess, for you. So let's see. Need to close off the array. Now we need to go up and grab the resource name. So this is what we've called it. So let's copy that. There's our logical name. And then the attribute name that we're looking for, if we go back to the return values of this, is the website URL. So we'll copy that identifier. Once again, this is like stuff that you'll learn once you get into Cloudformation. I'm just trying to take you through a couple examples so that it kind of becomes a little bit more real for you. So let's paste that property in there, get rid of this temporary field, and I believe this is how we want to do it. Let me check that one more time. So we're assigning value equal to this syntax of get attribute. Okay, I think we're good. Let's go ahead and save that once more. Let's try this one more time. Okay, so it didn't seem to yell at us this time, which is good. And we'll say that this stack is going to be called YouTube Cloudformation Sample Website. This can be anything. This is just what's going to show up in the console. You can give it some tags. Something that I've done in the past is say deploy type, and then you might say like Cloudformation, and then later on you can go search your entire AWS account for any tags that have a deploy type of Cloudformation. We won't do that here. Permissions, this is not necessary right now. Stack failure options, we'll set the defaults on that. Okay, so let's click next. All of those are defaults. Okay, it's going to say review. I think we're pretty good with this, and we'll go ahead and create the stack. So at this point, we have given AWS a template which had resources in it, just an S3 bucket, and we've said, go ahead and take this template and deploy it for me. In other words, rather than me clicking through the console, I'm just uploading a template and deterministically deploying that. So what you'll see is there's a create in progress, and if we refresh this, you'll see that there's a couple other actions that happened, and then the create is complete. So let's go over to S3 now, and you should see that bucket that we just created from the Cloudformation dashboard. All right, so here's our Cloudformation website, and we'll click this. Now you'll see that it's empty, so we'll have to upload our actual website there to serve the content. And then what you'll also notice is in the permissions, we don't have that bucket policy. Now we could have set that up in the Cloudformation template, and I'm gonna go ahead and pause the video and throw that in there because the details of how to do that are not necessarily relevant here. All right, so I've taken a minute to kind of figure out what we needed to do to get this bucket policy in our Cloudformation template. Now I want to just quickly show you kind of how I figured that out. I think it's useful to kind of go through that process. So we're back to the documentation. Previously, I was just sitting on this AWS S3 bucket under the AWS S3 section of the AWS Cloudformation documentation. You can see it's very, very nested to the point where there's so much. You need a search bar. Anyways, I was on the top level resource, and if you scroll down and you look right next to S3 bucket, you'll see S3 bucket policy. And if we look in the console, we can reasonably guess that that's what we are looking for to create that bucket policy. So I'll go ahead and click there. And then what you can do is you can kind of look at the examples at the very bottom, and you can see this policy right here, if you dig into it, is actually the policy that we need, minus this little condition for like specific refers. We don't really need that, but this right here is the syntax that we need to allow that policy, the public access policy. So I've come to Visual Studio Code. I've thrown in, let me scroll down. You can see that here is our original bucket resource. And then right here is the new resource, which is of type AWS S3 bucket policy. And then what I've done is I've taken this identifier, the logical ID, and you can see VS Code highlights the matches here. You can see that I'm referencing that bucket within the policy. So that's what's linking them together. So I went ahead and saved this template, and I want to take you through the process of deleting the bucket and redoing the template to get this right. Now, I haven't tested those updates yet, so we may stumble through this a little bit together, but that's okay. That's kind of part of the learning process here. So we'll go back to Cloudformation, which again, this is like the main place that you're going to be hanging out. This is where you go if you want to see all of the resources that you have in your AWS account that have been deployed through templates. So it's a great way to kind of manage those resources. Don't worry about these. These are some other things that I've got deployed before, but you can see here is the stack that we had previously deployed. So let's go ahead and delete that. When we delete that stack, it's going to, I believe, delete all the resources, but S3 buckets are one of the exceptions that have to have a certain deletion policy. So let me go see how that works. So I don't think that it's actually going to delete our S3 bucket when we delete this stack, although you can set that to happen. Okay, so if we click in there, we can click into the stack and you can see all of the events that are happening. So we've got deletes complete. And then we'll go back to stacks, and you can see that that stack is completely gone. So let's go back to S3 and see if that bucket was deleted. It's all according to the deletion policy that we set, and I cannot remember what exactly that was. It looks like it was deleted, so that's good. So now we can go back to Cloudformation, and we're going to upload that template that I just edited. And hopefully this time it will create that appropriate access policy for us. So we'll say the template's ready. We'll upload a template file. We'll say that sample template.json. Call this YouTube sample website. Next, and then create stack. It appears I have no syntax errors, which is good. Oh, I hope I did not upload the old version of that file. We will see. Okay, so you can see in our Cloudformation dashboard that we have created this stack successfully. And if all goes well, when we go back to S3, that bucket policy should be attached to the bucket that we just created. The access shows public, so that's a good sign. And if you go to permissions, you can see that this little policy has been filled in, and it's been filled in with the name of the bucket that we are looking at here. So it was, the references worked, that's all good. So now if we go to objects and we upload our index.html, so we'll add files. We'll use that index.html file and upload. You'll see that we uploaded the content, and theoretically this could happen in some sort of code pipeline. You could use AWS code deploy to do that action that we just did, and you could totally automate that. The most important part was that we created the S3 bucket with the policy through a Cloudformation template. So now if we close this out and we go on the properties of this bucket, scroll to the bottom and click on the endpoint, you can see we've got our Hello AWS app deployed to the web, and it's at that endpoint. Now, one last thing I wanted to show you, just for fun, if we go back to Cloudformation and we look at those outputs, so if you remember going back to the Visual Studio Code, we had this last little block of outputs where we had grabbed the website endpoint and the bucket name. You can actually view those if you click on the stack and then look at outputs. You can see that the bucket name is this, so that's what matched up with the S3 console. And then the endpoint that we dynamically grabbed, you can actually click on that, and it takes you directly to that site. So that's just a nice little convenience thing that you can do with Cloudformation templates. Now, the significance of all this is that you can manage these stacks, and you never have to actually go in and touch the individual resources and try to manage them that way. It's a lot less to keep track of, and you can even put these templates, these JSON or YAML documents, within version control. So if you wanted to put those in a GitHub repository, and if you're working on a team, you could commit those templates, and then your team can review the syntax, make sure that we're creating the right resources, and then once you deploy, or I guess once you merge that commit into the main branch or some staging branch, you could run some sort of pipeline that automatically deploys these Cloudformation templates to AWS. Now, let's say that you've created a bunch of resources and you've just been practicing with Cloudformation. Now, rather than going into, typing out S3, going to the S3 console, deleting the objects out of the bucket, and then deleting the bucket, it's as simple as clicking on your stack and saying delete. And that's going to delete all the resources that were created in that stack. Now, you can set deletion policies because this can potentially be dangerous, where if you have a critical resource that has some sort of information in it, like the S3 bucket, you can set a deletion policy so that even if you delete the stack, certain resources will stick around and stay persisted within your AWS account. In this particular case, our deletion policy was to go ahead and delete everything, so that should clean us out pretty good. Or actually, let's see. It said delete failed because there's probably some content within the bucket. So let's go ahead and click events. And you'll see the error code is that the bucket is not empty. So we would have to go delete the contents of the bucket first. So let's go ahead and click in there. We will delete this, or actually we can just go to click the bucket itself. And I think there's actions. Wonder if there's management. I was looking for an empty bucket. Let's go ahead and just delete this out of there. So we deleted the objects, and now we can go back to Cloudformation. And let's try this again. Let's go ahead and delete. Okay, so here is where it's going to ask you about potentially dangerous stack deletions. In this case, we're going to go ahead and click that so that we don't want to click that, but if you did, it would retain the resource. Let's go ahead and delete the stack. This should work this time, hopefully. Okay, so delete was complete. So now if we go back to stacks, that stack is entirely gone, and we've cleaned up all of our resources. All right, so it's getting pretty dark here. As you can see in my camera background, we've been going for quite some time, and we've covered the two big ones here. So the AWS console and AWS Cloudformation. The rest of these ways that you might deploy a web app or manage AWS services, they're all derivations of these first two. So CDK is basically just one level of abstraction on top of Cloudformation, and it uses Cloudformation under the hood. And then the AWS client is more of a direct API that's not necessarily going to use Cloudformation, but it's a direct way to create, update, or delete resources. Now, for the sake of keeping this video a reasonable amount of time, I think I'm probably going to skip on these last three. These are things that you can look into on your own. I apologize if anyone wanted to see these, but I'm realizing this video is going to be pretty long already. So the last thing that I want to do before I let you go here is talk a little bit about preventing large AWS bills. So let's jump back into the console and let's type in Cost Explorer. Okay, so what we're going to do in Cost Explorer is just dive into the main things that you want to look out for, and then we'll also talk about setting up budgets. So this is the, we've got power user access, which I believe this user is allowed to set budgets for this account. So what we can see is if we view in Cost Explorer, you can map out the cost by daily, hourly, monthly. I think I might have hourly set up. Or actually, this is a paid feature. It's like a couple cents per day. something like that if you wanted to enable hourly billing. But daily is fine for now. You can see I've got a few costs here and there. And usually what you click on is usage type, and that's going to show you what you're being charged for. So you can see here that I'm being charged for a hosted zone, which I actually didn't know that I had. So you could then go, type in Route 53, and you would click on that and go delete the resource or manage it if you're being charged for something that you don't need. And then finally, if you wanted to go set budgets, which I would highly recommend, this is where you can kind of prevent the big cost from coming in. So once this loads, I'll kind of show you how it works. So as you can see, I've got some budgets already set up. This was an old test account, so not using it actively anymore. But if you wanted to create a budget, you're probably going to put in a cost budget. It's the most basic one. So let's call this test budget. What we want to do, I always like to set up a daily spend so that if you start overspending really quick or a resource starts to run out of control, you'll catch it within the day. So what you'll want to do is a recurring budget. We'll start it today. It's going to be a fixed amount. And let's say that anytime you reach over $5 of daily spend, you want to get some sort of alert. Okay, so this is where you set up unblended cost. This is basically all AWS services. You want to make sure that you set that so you're covering your entire account. You'll click next. So we budgeted $5. Now this is important. You have to actually set an alert. If you just click next, you're not getting alerts, which is kind of the whole purpose of this. So let's add an alert threshold, and let's say 100% of the budgeted amount, and that's going to be actual. So once that happens, then you might put in your email address. And what it's going to do is once you reach that alert threshold, it's going to email you, and that's how you're going to make sure that you're not spending too much on your AWS account and prevent large bills. Now, of course, you can go back to Cost Explorer and dig in to things a little bit further. There's a lot of clicking that you have to do, but you can set all sorts of filters for more advanced stuff, and you can even create reports. So you might create a new report based on certain filters, and then you can always pull that report up and get a quick look at how much you're spending in your AWS account. All right, so that's pretty much it for this video. I know we kind of skipped on a few things, but mainly for the purpose of keeping this video in a manageable amount of time. Once again, my goal here with this video was not necessarily to walk you through a specific service, but more so to give you AWS from 10,000 feet and how to think about it. What are the common places you're going to end up? So Cloudformation is one of those things, and also just how to manage users, all that kind of stuff. Mainly just to take that intimidation level down a notch and give you some confidence that if you read the documentation, you should be able to figure out AWS to some level and use it effectively. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments. If you have any questions, I can do some follow-up videos. So just drop them below in the comments. And until next time, I will see you later.